The conservative media landscape, a sprawling, complex ecosystem of cable news, podcasts, and online platforms, hummed with a familiar, self-assured rhythm. At its apex stood Tucker Carlson, a towering figure whose nightly show was more than just a broadcast. It was a nightly sermon, a bastion of combative rhetoric and perceived intellectual dominance. He was the undisputed king of the populist right, rarely challenged from within his own ideological sphere. His arguments often presented as unassailable truths, his critiques of the elites and establishment resonating deeply with millions. His show was a carefully constructed fortress, designed to amplify his voice and dismantle his opponents, never to host a genuine intellectual threat from within his own ranks. Into this carefully curated domain stepped Pat Buchanan, a name that evoked a different era of conservatism entirely. Buchanan was no newcomer. He was a political veteran, a seasoned commentator whose career spanned decades, from the Nixon White House to multiple presidential campaigns. He was a deeply intellectual figure, known for his formidable historical erudition, his sharp, often contrarian, wit, and a brand of conservatism rooted in traditionalism, nationalism, and a pronounced skepticism towards foreign interventionism. His intellect was undeniable, his arguments meticulously researched, and his presence on any platform commanded respect, even from those who vehemently disagreed with him. He represented an older, perhaps more academic, strain of conservative thought, a stark contrast to Carlson's more visceral, emotionally charged populism. Carlson, in his own mind, likely viewed Buchanan as an elder statesman, a revered, if somewhat anachronistic figure. He probably saw Buchanan's past views on issues like trade protectionism or a non-interventionist foreign policy as generally aligned with his own America First agenda, albeit expressed with a more classical, less overtly combative, tone. Carlson would anticipate a cordial, perhaps even nostalgic exchange, a segment where Buchanan offered wise, if slightly dated, commentary that Carlson could then skillfully integrate into his own modern populist narrative. It would be an opportunity to reinforce his own stature as a leader capable of uniting various factions of conservative thought under his broad tent, a respectful nod to the past before confidently steering the conversation into his preferred contemporary channels. However, beneath this veneer of anticipated cordiality lay an unspoken tension. Carlson's show thrived on setting the debate, on defining who the elites were, and on presenting his arguments as the ultimate, unassailable truth. Buchanan, with his deep historical knowledge and nuanced perspectives, represented a subtle threat to this carefully constructed reality. His arguments, rooted in decades of observation and scholarly study, had the potential to expose the more simplified or emotionally driven narratives that Carlson often employed. Buchanan's brand of conservatism was less about outrage and more about intellectual rigor, a quiet power that could subtly undercut Carlson's bombast. The stage was set for a discussion that, unbeknownst to Carlson, would not be the easy, deferential exchange he expected, but a profound intellectual challenge from a figure whose shadow stretched long over the conservative movement. The invitation for Pat Buchanan to appear on Tucker Carlson tonight wasn't extended on a whim. The chosen topic, the crisis of Western identity, was tailor-made to draw a large conservative audience, touching on themes both men frequently discussed: immigration, cultural decline, and geopolitical shifts. For Carlson, it was a familiar battleground where he typically articulated his populist nationalist views with unchallenged authority. He envisioned a segment where Buchanan, the elder statesman, would offer historical validation and intellectual gravitas to Carlson's own, often more recent, arguments. It would be a nod to the intellectual lineage of modern conservatism, a respectful passing of the torch, orchestrated perfectly to bolster Carlson's own perceived intellectual depth. Carlson's expectation was clear: a spirited but ultimately collaborative debate. He anticipated Buchanan would echo many of his own concerns: perhaps with more historical nuance, allowing Carlson to seamlessly interject with contemporary applications and push his own agenda. He saw Buchanan as a sage, a source of historical anecdotes and weighty pronouncements that would ultimately serve to fortify Carlson's positions, not undermine them. There would be polite disagreement, perhaps, but within the bounds of a shared ideological framework, leading to a conclusion that invariably confirmed the anxieties and grievances Carlson broadcast nightly. However, Pat Buchanan arrived with a different agenda. A meticulous scholar and a veteran of countless intellectual skirmishes, he was not simply there to offer a benign historical footnote. Buchanan sensed a unique opportunity on this prominent platform, a chance to articulate a deeper, perhaps more uncomfortable, truth that he felt was being overshadowed or even distorted by the prevailing narratives within contemporary conservatism, including Carlson's. He prepared diligently, delving into historical texts, economic data, and philosophical arguments, honing his points with surgical precision. He wasn't there to affirm Carlson, he was there to make a point, and if that point diverged sharply from Carlson's established tenets, then so be it. His objective was intellectual clarity, not political conformity. The audience, tuning in that evening, anticipated a lively but ultimately predictable conservative discussion. They expected Carlson to be his usual combative self, perhaps allowing Buchanan to offer a few well-placed historical insights, but always steering the conversation back to his central themes. The anticipation was for a display of rhetorical skill, a reinforcement of their shared worldview, not an intellectual ambush. Viewers were ready for Carlson to dominate, to win the debate as he almost always did. No one, perhaps least of all Tucker Carlson himself, expected the profound intellectual dismantling that was about to unfold live on national television, a moment that would redefine the power dynamics of conservative discourse. The segment began with the familiar, polished veneer of Tucker Carlson tonight. Carlson, impeccably dressed as always, launched into a warm, almost reverent introduction of Pat Buchanan, highlighting his decades of service, his intellectual prowess, and his enduring influence on conservative thought. Tonight, we are honored to have a man who has shaped the very intellectual bedrock of our movement. Carlson intoned, his voice smooth and welcoming, creating an atmosphere of shared purpose and mutual admiration. Buchanan, seated opposite him, offered a polite nod, his expression composed, almost stoic, a slight smile playing on his lips. The initial pleasantries were exchanged, a comfortable dance of respect between two prominent figures on the conservative stage. As the discussion turned to the crisis of Western identity, Buchanan, with his characteristic calm and gravitas, introduced his opening argument. He spoke not merely of contemporary symptoms, immigration rates, or cultural shifts, but delved deep into historical precedents, the decline of empires, and the philosophical underpinnings of Western civilization's past vulnerabilities. He invoked figures and events far more distant than Carlson typically referenced, subtly implying that the current crisis was not just a modern phenomenon but a cyclical pattern rooted in deeper, more complex historical forces. He began to discuss the long-term demographic shifts over centuries and the erosion of cultural unity from within, emphasizing a historical inevitability that transcended immediate political battles. Carlson, ever the master of redirecting narrative, initially attempted to frame Buchanan's point within his own established talking points. He offered a slight nod, a half-smile, or an interjection like, "Right, Pat, and what you're really talking about is the failures of the globalist elite, isn't it? The way they've intentionally opened borders and undermined national sovereignty." He tried to absorb Buchanan's academic insights into his own populist agenda, seeking to distill complex historical analysis into a simpler, more politically actionable narrative that resonated with his audience's immediate grievances. He was adept at this, taking a nuanced point and fitting it into his pre-existing framework, never truly engaging with its potential to diverge. However, for a discerning viewer, a subtle but palpable intellectual mismatch began to emerge. Buchanan's arguments possessed a gravitas, a depth of historical reference and philosophical insight that subtly challenged Carlson's often more emotionally charged or superficially researched points. There was a quiet confidence in Buchanan's voice, a steady rhythm to his delivery that suggested a profound understanding of the subject far beyond the daily news cycle. Carlson's usual quick interjections seemed to bounce off Buchanan's intellectual armor rather than penetrating it. A slight hesitation in Carlson's responses, or a flicker of unexpected seriousness in his gaze, signaled that this wasn't going to be the easy, deferential segment he had anticipated. The unspoken tension in the studio began to build, a prelude to the unexpected intellectual clash that was about to erupt. The polite veneer of the discussion quickly began to crack as Pat Buchanan moved beyond subtle divergences and articulated his central, challenging thesis. With an almost professorial air, he dove into an argument that was meticulously constructed, deeply researched, and profoundly unsettling for Carlson's usual framework. Buchanan contended that the decline of Western identity was not solely, or even primarily, due to external forces like immigration or globalist conspiracies, as Carlson often argued. Instead, Buchanan asserted, the rot began from within, a moral and spiritual decay, a loss of historical memory, and a self-inflicted abandonment of traditional values and national solidarity, hastened by a consumerist culture and a loss of faith. He cited specific historical periods, philosophical shifts, and even internal cultural movements, drawing clear lines of cause and effect that pointed inwards rather than outwards. Carlson, visibly blindsided by this unexpected pivot, was immediately forced into an uncomfortable defensive posture. His confident posture stiffened, and his eyes, usually sharp and accusatory, narrowed as he tried to grasp the full implications of Buchanan's argument. This wasn't the external enemy he was accustomed to railing against. This was an internal critique, a self-indictment of the very culture Carlson claimed to defend, yet, in Buchanan's view, inadvertently contributed to its erosion. Carlson stammered slightly, attempting to pick apart Buchanan's reasoning, demanding sources for his sweeping historical claims, or trying to reframe the internal decay as merely a symptom of external pressures, a rare and difficult position for the typically dominant host. Buchanan's response was delivered with effortless authority. He rattled off names of historians Carlson might not have immediately recognized, quoted forgotten texts, or cited specific demographic trends from centuries past with astonishing recall. One merely needs to examine Gibbon on Rome or even Tocqueville on America, Buchanan stated calmly, to understand that internal dissolution often precedes external conquest. His command of the subject matter was vastly superior, his arguments buttressed by a lifetime of study, leaving Carlson visibly struggling to find a counter-argument that wasn't superficial or easily dismissed. Each of Buchanan's historical reference points landed with the weight of undeniable scholarship, forcing Carlson to confront a depth of knowledge he hadn't anticipated. A palpable wave of realization rippled through the audience. Accustomed to Carlson's intellectual dominance, they sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding. The smooth, predictable flow of Tucker Carlson tonight had been irrevocably disrupted. There was an audible murmur as viewers leaned in, their eyes fixed on the screen, recognizing that they were witnessing a rare intellectual challenge unfolding live on air. Carlson, the master of the modern conservative stage, was, for the first time in memory, visibly outmatched, his usual bluster rendered ineffective by the quiet, scholarly precision of his guest. The intellectual battlefield had just been redefined, and Carlson was clearly on the back foot. Scrambling to regain his footing, Tucker Carlson instinctively defaulted to his familiar rhetorical playbook. He began by attempting to mischaracterize Buchanan's nuanced argument, hoping to create a straw man that would be easier to attack. "So, what you're really suggesting, Pat," Carlson interjected, his voice laced with a subtle attempt at condescension, "is that we should just embrace decline, that we should simply throw up our hands and say, 'The West is doomed,' rather than fighting against the forces trying to destroy it from the outside?" He tried to twist Buchanan's historical analysis of internal decay into a defeatist, passive surrender, a narrative that would alienate Carlson's action-oriented audience. He also attempted to personalize the debate, subtly implying Buchanan's views were perhaps too academic, too detached from the urgent realities of the present, or simply outdated. Pat Buchanan, however, remained utterly unperturbed. He met Carlson's attempts at redirection with a calm, almost paternal expression, his gaze unwavering. "No, Tucker, that is not at all what I am suggesting," Buchanan stated, his voice even and deliberate, correcting the mischaracterization with effortless clarity. "What I am saying is precisely that unless we address the internal spiritual and moral decay, the loss of communal bonds, and the pervasive self-indulgence, then any external defense, any fight against forces from the outside, will ultimately be futile. A house divided against itself, or a house rotten at its foundations, cannot stand, regardless of how strong its walls appear." He refused to be drawn into a simplistic, externalized conflict, steadfastly redirecting the focus back to his core, uncomfortable truth. Buchanan's arguments were presented as unassailable, buttressed by their deep factual basis and undeniable historical grounding. When Carlson challenged his premises, Buchanan responded not with opinion, but with specific dates, names of historical figures, and details of past societal collapse. "One need only look at the demographic trends in Western Europe since the 1960s, Buchanan calmly asserted, or the dissolution of traditional institutions here in America, to see that our crisis is as much a matter of choice and internal erosion as external threat." Each factual counterpoint he made landed with the weight of undeniable scholarship, leaving Carlson visibly struggling to find a rebuttal that wasn't superficial or easily dismissed in comparison. Carlson's frustration became increasingly evident. His usual confident smirk faltered, replaced by a tightening of his jaw and a subtle clenching of his hands beneath the desk. He fidgeted in his seat, his eyes darting towards the monitor, a clear signal of his internal struggle to find an effective rebuttal. He was accustomed to dominating, to winning every verbal skirmish with rhetorical agility, and Buchanan's calm, fact-based dismantling of his arguments left him visibly unnerved and unable to regain intellectual control. The audience, sensing this rare discomfiture in their usually unflappable host, leaned forward, captivated by the unexpected turn of events. The debate intensified, morphing into a rapid-fire intellectual chess match, yet one where Pat Buchanan consistently maintained the intellectual high ground. Carlson, no longer attempting subtle redirection, began throwing out quick, aggressive questions, trying to catch Buchanan off guard or force him into an emotional response. "Are you saying our ancestors were weak then?" Carlson demanded, attempting to provoke a nationalistic defense. "Are you dismissing the genuine threats we face today?" He pressed, trying to reframe Buchanan's nuanced historical view as a dismissal of contemporary perils. Buchanan, however, remained impassive, his composure unshakable. He met each rapid-fire question with a steady flow of precise, historically informed answers, methodically peeling back layers of Carlson's assumptions. "No, Tucker, I am saying that strength lies not just in arms or economy, but in internal coherence and shared purpose," Buchanan calmly articulated, his voice resonating with authority. "The genuine threats we face today are exacerbated, not diminished, by a society that has lost its moorings, that no longer knows its own history or its own soul." He refused to be drawn into Carlson's binary framing, consistently offering a more complex, deeply rooted perspective. Carlson, recognizing he was losing ground on the original internal decline argument, desperately tried to pivot to new topics or introduce seemingly irrelevant side issues, hoping to distract the audience and regain his footing. "But what about the border crisis, Pat? Isn't that the most immediate threat to Western identity?" Carlson interjected, attempting to shift the focus to a more comfortable, externalized problem. "Or the globalist agendas pushing for open borders and cultural relativism?" Surely that's the real issue. Buchanan, however, refused to be diverted. With a calm, unwavering focus, he consistently brought the discussion back to his original, challenging point. While the border is indeed a critical concern, Tucker, he stated, his voice firm yet respectful, it is a symptom of a deeper malady. Why does a nation lose the will to secure its borders? Why does it question its own identity? These are not questions of external conspiracy alone, but of internal conviction. Let's stick to the fundamental issue, the erosion of Western man's belief in his own civilization, which makes him susceptible to these external pressures. He wouldn't allow Carlson to escape the intellectual trap he had set, repeatedly drawing the conversation back to the uncomfortable truth of internal decay. The audience, now fully invested in the unusual intellectual battle, began to visibly react, murmuring and shifting in their seats, sensing that a rarely seen intellectual outmaneuvering was underway. The segment reached its undeniable climax, a moment of profound intellectual exposure that would replay across media for days. Pat Buchanan, his voice steady and imbued with the weight of decades of study, delivered the decisive blow. He had allowed Carlson to chase various tangents, only to consistently pull him back to the core argument of internal decline. Now, Buchanan saw his opening. "Tucker," he began, his tone almost mournful, "you speak of fighting for the West. But what is the West if not its unique spiritual and moral foundations? When a civilization abandons its core tenets, its faith, its historical memory, its familial bonds, it becomes a shell, incapable of true resistance. We saw this in the late Roman Empire, where the external barbarians found a spiritually exhausted populace. Then came the precise, devastating historical anecdote." Buchanan leaned slightly forward, his eyes fixed on Carlson. "Consider the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, he stated, referring to Charles Martel's victory over invading Muslim armies. That was not just a military victory, it was a victory of a people who believed in what they were defending. Do you believe, Tucker, that a nation whose children are taught to despise their own history, whose institutions preach self-loathing, whose population views patriotism as bigotry, possesses the same will to fight? We are not losing the West because of a lack of physical strength, but a lack of spiritual resolve." He paused, letting the profound implications of his words hang in the air. "You are fighting the external battle, Tucker, but the internal war, the war for the soul of the West, is already being lost because we lack the conviction to fight it ourselves." Carlson's face, usually a canvas of controlled indignation, registered a clear, unmistakable moment of intellectual defeat. His eyes widened slightly, his jaw slackened, and for a fleeting second, the practiced mask of the unflappable host slipped. There was no immediate retort, no witty comeback, no pre-rehearsed counter-argument that came to mind. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and publicly schooled by the veteran intellectual. He had focused on the enemies at the gates. Buchanan had pointed to the rot within the walls, a critique Carlson was ill-equipped to counter. A collective gasp swept through the studio audience, followed by a stunned silence. Some audience members exchanged wide-eyed glances, others covered their mouths in disbelief. The perception was undeniable. Carlson, the intellectual pugilist, had just been decisively outmatched on his own show. Buchanan's argument was delivered not with anger or triumph, but with the quiet, devastating authority of a scholar imparting undeniable truth. It was a scholarly blow, a profound, authoritative statement that left Carlson intellectually exposed and visibly reeling. The schooling was complete, and its reverberations would shake the very foundations of Carlson's carefully constructed image. Following the devastating intellectual blow, Tucker Carlson's composure completely unraveled. His usual polished demeanor, his characteristic smirk, and his controlled interjections gave way to a visible desperation. He abandoned all pretense of a reasoned debate, resorting to less polished, more frantic tactics. He began interrupting Buchanan mid-sentence, his voice rising uncharacteristically. "But that's an unfair characterization, Pat," he stammered, his eyes darting wildly. "You're ignoring the active forces working against us. It's not just some philosophical concept of spiritual decay." His arguments became increasingly thin, emotional, and devoid of the factual grounding he demanded from others. He made vague, sweeping accusations without substance, trying desperately to shift the blame or dismiss the depth of Buchanan's critique. Pat Buchanan, however, remained remarkably calm, almost serene, amidst Carlson's flustered performance. He watched Carlson's agitated state with a mild, almost bemused expression. He might offer a slight, knowing smile or a gentle shake of his head, subtly highlighting Carlson's loss of composure. His responses, when he could get them in, were still concise and factual, refusing to descend into Carlson's emotional level. This calm contrasted sharply with Carlson's rising agitation, thereby amplifying the host's discomfiture and making his unraveling even more apparent to the audience. Buchanan's steady presence acted as a mirror, reflecting Carlson's intellectual and emotional disarray. Carlson visibly lost complete control of the segment's flow. He struggled to regain the conversational reins, trying to cut to commercial or pivot to another point entirely. He gestured frantically to off-camera crew, a clear signal of his distress. "We're going to have to... this is a fascinating discussion, but we're running out of time here," he stammered, his voice strained and unconvincing. The segment, usually a tightly choreographed performance of Carlson's dominance and intellectual superiority, descended into an unmanaged, chaotic exchange where the host appeared visibly defeated and utterly unable to lead the discussion. The audience reacted strongly to Carlson's discomfort. Some of his loyal supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats, feeling a rare pang of embarrassment for their usually triumphant host. Others, particularly those critical of Carlson, expressed a quiet, almost gleeful enjoyment at witnessing his rare unraveling. Social media, already abuzz, lit up with real-time observations about Carlson's visible distress, magnifying the public perception of his intellectual defeat. The air in the studio was thick with the weight of an unexpected shift in power. The tables had truly turned, and Carlson, for once, was clearly on the losing side of a live debate, his usual rhetorical weapons rendered useless. The clock on the studio wall loomed large, a silent, unforgiving countdown to the end of the segment. Tucker Carlson, his face etched with frustration and a desperate need to regain control, glanced at it repeatedly. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that he could not win or recover the debate within the remaining time. Buchanan's arguments, rooted in deep historical understanding, were too robust to be refuted with his usual rhetorical jabs, and his attempts to discredit Buchanan had only highlighted his own intellectual deficit. The grim realization dawned on him. The only way to escape this escalating embarrassment was to terminate the segment, however abruptly. With a strained smile that barely reached his eyes, Carlson leaned into the microphone, his voice stiff with forced cordiality. "Pat, we are unfortunately completely out of time here," he declared, the words sounding hollow and unconvincing. He gestured vaguely off-camera, as if receiving an urgent signal from a producer, though the urgency was clearly his own. There was no graceful transition, no polite invitation for a return visit, no customary pleasantries. It was an abrupt, almost panicked termination of the discussion, designed to halt the public display of his intellectual defeat and escape the unwinnable intellectual battle that Buchanan had so skillfully orchestrated. The segment simply stopped, hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. Pat Buchanan, however, maintained his impeccable composure to the very end. As Carlson fumbled to conclude the segment, Buchanan offered a subtle, knowing glance towards the camera, a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk of quiet victory playing on his lips. His posture remained upright, his expression calm and dignified. He didn't interrupt Carlson's hurried wrap-up. Instead, he simply absorbed the moment, allowing Carlson's discomfort to speak for itself. He then calmly unclipped his microphone and, with a slight nod, exited the stage, his measured movements contrasting sharply with Carlson's flustered state, cementing his quiet triumph. The segment cut to commercial with a palpable sense of unresolved tension that lingered in the studio and permeated viewers' homes. The abrupt, almost panicked, ending left a strong impression of an intellectual defeat for Carlson, an image rarely, if ever, seen on his highly controlled program. The audience was left with the uncomfortable, yet undeniable sight of Tucker Carlson being outmatched and forced to prematurely end a discussion. It was a rare public moment of vulnerability for the often bombastic host, a sight that would linger long after the broadcast concluded and that would fuel countless discussions in the days to come. As the Tucker Carlson Tonight broadcast abruptly cut to commercial, the control room descended into a mixture of stunned silence and frantic, exhilarated chatter. Producers, audio engineers, and floor managers exchanged wide-eyed glances, some stifling grins, others shaking their heads in disbelief. They had just witnessed something unprecedented. Their usually dominant host, the master of rhetorical combat, had been clearly, visibly, and publicly outmaneuvered on live television. The intense tension that had filled the studio during Buchanan's intellectual dismantling now gave way to a surge of shock, amusement, and a palpable sense of having just experienced a moment that would transcend the typical nightly news cycle. Before the commercial break was even over, the digital world began to ignite. Smartphones, recording the live broadcast, became instant conduits for global dissemination. Tweets, posts, and threads exploded across Twitter, Facebook, and various online forums, all centered on the extraordinary segment. Viewers, many having watched in real time, immediately latched onto the narrative of Carlson being schooled or destroyed by Buchanan. Key quotes from Buchanan and screenshots of Carlson's visible discomfort were rapidly shared and dissected. The hashtag #TuckerGotSchooled or Buchanan wins began to trend, spreading like wildfire across the internet, ensuring that the incident would not remain confined to a single broadcast. The unusual exchange quickly caught the attention of other media outlets, both mainstream and rival conservative ones. News aggregators began to flag the segment as a significant anomaly, a rare intellectual upset. Pundits and commentators from across the political spectrum started to queue up to offer their analysis of Carlson's rare public intellectual defeat. Recognizing the significant implications of the encounter, journalists began crafting articles detailing the unexpected turn of events, highlighting Buchanan's calm authority against Carlson's uncharacteristic discomfiture. The media landscape sensed a major shift in the narrative around Carlson. Carlson's immediate post-show reaction, or rather, the lack thereof, spoke volumes. There was no immediate tweet from Carlson's personal account, no quick statement from his producers to frame the incident. His team was visibly scrambling to control the narrative, to assess the potential damage to his carefully cultivated brand, and to formulate a strategic response. They recognized that this was not just another heated debate, it was a moment where their star host's intellectual armor was publicly pierced, and the fallout was already spreading rapidly, promising to be a major talking point in the days to come. The moment the broadcast cut to commercial, the digital world erupted. Clips of Buchanan's calm, surgical dismantling of Carlson's arguments went instantly viral, solidifying the narrative. Tucker Carlson had been schooled on live television. Social media buzzed with analysis, celebrating Buchanan's intellectual prowess and highlighting Carlson's visible discomfiture and his abrupt, almost panicked segment cut. Pundits across the political spectrum weighed in, marveling at Buchanan's unyielding command of historical fact against Carlson's more rhetorical style. This rare public intellectual defeat significantly impacted Carlson's carefully cultivated brand as an unchallengeable conservative voice. While his loyal base largely dismissed the incident, broader audiences and critics now scrutinized his arguments more intensely, recognizing a chink in his rhetorical armor. Network executives, unaccustomed to such an on-air upset, faced internal discussions about managing future guest appearances. Carlson, though continuing his influential career, likely adjusted his approach, perhaps becoming more cautious in direct, unscripted intellectual sparring, preferring more controlled environments. Conversely, the incident propelled Pat Buchanan back into a prominent intellectual spotlight. His nuanced arguments, often overlooked by mainstream conservative media, gained renewed attention. His status as a serious, historically grounded conservative intellectual was powerfully reaffirmed, serving as a model for how substance and calm authority could prevail over mere spectacle. The debate became a case study in effective intellectual confrontation, demonstrating the enduring power of deep knowledge. Ultimately, the schooling left an indelible mark on modern media history. It highlighted the internal tensions within conservative thought, particularly the clash between traditional intellectual rigor and modern populist rhetoric. More broadly, it served as a potent reminder of the public's hunger for genuine intellectual engagement and the profound impact that unyielding facts, delivered with calm conviction, could have on even the most formidable media figures. It was a moment that underscored the value of substance over showmanship, solidifying its place as a defining instance of intellectual combat in the digital age. Thank you for watching. If you found this video fascinating, here is another one, and don't forget to express your thoughts in the comments section.